The Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights is a new organization that was founded a couple months ago based on the work that several of us have been doing over the past 3 years to create an environmental rights amendment here in the state of Maryland. But one of the things that we know is that we know while we're working for this capstone gold ring project of creating a constitutional amendment to assure that everyone in Maryland has a right and access to a healthy and healthful environment, that it's going to be a long haul. It's going to be a big lift. And along the way, we felt we needed to have additional ancillary tactics and prospects to help us achieve that goal. By the way, even when we achieve that goal to have an environmental human rights amendment, there will need to be laws, policies, and regulations that will help it be implemented, because the amendment is a broad stroke provision to say that everyone has a right to a healthy environment, and access to a healthy environment then has to be interpreted by laws and by the courts. So what we want to do on the way to the amendment is to work in the legislative and regulatory arenas to give teeth and precision to what that amendment might mean. And since part of the heart of the amendment is environmental justice, one of the things that we're looking to do is to help Maryland create ways to ensure environmental justice going forward and correct environmental injustices that currently exist. And we could do that granularly, sort of in a case-by-case basis, location-by-case basis, and some initiatives and tactics take that route, and that is helpful. But we were hoping that maybe we could find ways that we could guide our state to create statewide methods to create umbrella environmental justice policies, regulations, initiatives. To do that, we needed help. So we went to Chesapeake Legal Alliance and said, one of the things we need is a survey of the best statewide environmental justice practices in the United States. And they said, we've got the guy for you. So they connected us with their wonderful legal intern, and that is Gabe Almario, who is a second-year law student at Georgetown Law. And anybody who knows law schools knows that Georgetown Law is absolutely a top-tier law school. So we're thrilled, Gabe, that you're with us. And he is, as I say, legal intern at Chesapeake Legal Alliance, and he has done a review of states in the United States that have these statewide environmental justice structures and policies. And so we're here, Gabe, to learn from and with you. So before you start, sure that all of you are muted. I think actually I could do that, but Gabe, if I mute everybody, you're gonna have to unmute yourself, okay?
That sounds good. Thanks, Nina.
Okay, so go unmute yourself. I will now put myself on mute, and we'll learn with Gabe. And Gabe, you guide us into the kinds of interaction you want. In the meantime, I will be monitoring the chat, and if people have questions along the way, I will be recording them, and then we can, at the end, perhaps go through those questions. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that works with me.
All righty, take it away.
Okay, great. Let me get set up real quick. Okay.
Actually, Gabe, if I could just interrupt for 1 second. I see that
Sure.
Eden has in fact joined us. Eden, thank you so much, Chief of Staff of Delegate Solomon. We're delighted to have you here. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Before we get started, if anybody has issues seeing any of the text on my slides, feel free to let either myself or Nina know. I usually work with 2 monitors, but I'm operating on just 1 today. And so I only have access, I'd like to access my notes on the side. And so that's why the presentation portion that you're seeing is a bit smaller than I would like. but just let Nina or myself know if you'd like any of this language expanded for easier viewing, and I'm always happy to share my slides after. But thank you, Nina, for the wonderful introduction. I'm Gabe Almario. I have been fortunate enough to be a summer legal intern with Chesapeake Legal Alliance. And let's go through the outline for today's presentation. First, I'll cover a bit of the background research that led to this kind of nationwide review of EJ groups and policies in the US, and a bit of the context behind why I researched the way I did. And then I'll provide a quick overview of my findings addressing all the states that do have environmental justice advisory bodies. And then I will finish by pointing to several states and some of their components that I think that have been really effective and I think can help inform the direction of Maryland's environmental justice advisory bodies. So as Nina discussed and touched upon, earlier this summer, I was lucky enough to present alongside CLA's policy director, Evan Isaacson, a group of slides that were entitled Unfulfilled Promise, which identified Maryland statutes and programs that might help pass an environmental rights amendment, but were in disrepair. And one of these programs was Maryland's Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, also known as the Commission. And the Commission is what you can call an environmental justice advisory body. What their charge essentially is to advise the state and assess and recommend environmental justice policies on a state level. But in my presentation, I noted how the Commission has several shortfalls. So in the execution of projects, for example, I noted that the Commission is really good at coming up with projects, but in actually seeing them all the way through, there was improvement to be made. Also, when it came to membership, I saw when I was doing research for the presentation, I saw that there was about a 25% vacancy on the Commission itself. And looking back through meeting minutes, it seemed like the Commission was struggling with chronic vacancies. And the last kind of weakness that I saw in the Commission was communication. And that's not only with citizens throughout Maryland, but I think critically communication with the legislature and communication with the governor. And so some of my research stemming from this presentation was addressing this problem. How do we improve the Commission so that moving forward, it can better serve Maryland citizens, it can help pass an environmental rights amendment. And one of the solutions, well, one of the routes to finding a solution, I'd rather say, is that we should look to other states and see, are there any model advisory bodies in these other states that can inform the Commission and EJ policy related initiatives in Maryland? And in doing some baseline research, I found a 2018 report from Virginia's Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. And this is Virginia's, essentially back in 2018, this was Virginia's EJ advisory body. So kind of a mirror image, if you will, in terms of the duties that the Commission for Maryland is supposed to fulfill. And what the Advisory Council had done is they had searched all 50 states for these EJ advisory bodies, these bodies that are supposed to produce environmental justice policy on a state level. And they also recorded components of each one. They identified several states that had model bodies or initiatives, and then they also recommended certain structural improvements to their own commission. So, and let me know if this table that you're seeing is a bit too small. I'm happy to expand it once I do a quick overview of the 2018 Advisory Commission's findings. So this is the status of, what you're seeing right now is the status of environmental justice advisory bodies as they were in 2018. So there were 2 states. Oh, 1 second. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to expand this a bit. Okay, hopefully that'll make it a bit easier. Thank you for letting me know that it was a bit small. Yes, so in 2018, there were 12 states that had environmental justice advisory bodies. One more, sorry, 1 second. And across these various advisory bodies, it seemed like many of them were doing well with communicating with impacted communities. So this 4th column from the left, all of these X's denote that, yes, the advisory body for this state was in fact doing, did in fact have this responsibility. And the report also noted that in terms of creating and actually implementing a mapping tool to help identify environmental justice communities, a lot of these advisory bodies and a lot of these states were doing really well. So this far right column kind of denotes that. But at the same time, there was a lot of room for improvement. So in directing funds to communities, for example, this 3rd column from the left, you see a dearth of X's, noting that a lot of these states and a lot of these advisory bodies were not helping to provide funds to communities that needed it the most. And we also see a lot of these advisory bodies had not done much to place EJ policy on the map in their own state. And in conducting this research, the Virginia Advisory Council on Environmental Justice noted 3 states that had performed really well in creating and implementing environmental justice policy, and they were California, New York, and Massachusetts. So this really steered how I conducted my own research, and I figured I should use this as a template to direct. 1 second. Sorry, I can't fully enlarge the screen just because I have my notes to the side, and if I fully enlarged it, you would also see my notes, and I suppose I want to hide the ball a bit. But hopefully enlarging this window helps. Thanks again for your patience. But so the 2018 research really was the springboard for my own research to say, okay, here's the status of environmental justice advisory bodies in 2018. What has progress looked like in these 2 years? And this is what I found in 2020. What you're seeing here, which I'll enlarge, is essentially the same chart, but with the data updated. These blue marks in the chart denote where there was a change in an existing advisory body. So for example, if we were to look at North Carolina and look at how North Carolina performed in the second column from the left, it looks like from 2018 to 2020, their EJ advisory body has in fact helped shape state policy and helped implement environmental justice. And what I denoted in this peach kind of color were states that had adopted or formed environmental justice advisory bodies since 2018. So these 4 states, Colorado, Connecticut, Oregon, and Washington, were states that that were omitted from the 2018 results, but I have now included in the 2020 results. So as a quick overview, we see that there's been a jump from 12 to 16 states with advisory bodies. And we've seen a lot of growth across these bodies themselves. So in terms of disseminating information to the public on EJ initiatives, this second column from the right, we've seen there are 4 advisory bodies back in 2018, but now there are 15 advisory bodies that I found were actually disseminating information either online or through actual events in person or now virtually to teach people on environmental justice. And we've seen similar growth for shaping state policy. So there are 6 states with EJ bodies that have now ramped up their policy efforts. And I found that 14 of these 16 states had very effective advisory bodies in shaping state policy. We saw a marginal growth in communications with marginalized communities, going from 11 states to 13 states. And likewise, a similar marginal growth in these states using environmental justice mapping tools, going from 7 states in 2018 to 9 states in 2020. Okay, now I'd like to move over to some of the highlights that I found in my research that I think serve as models, not only for the commission, but for advisory bodies throughout the nation. Some of the first highlights that I would like to address are what I call structural support, that lends structural support to the advisory body. I think one critical thing to keep in mind in assessing the productivity of an advisory body is seeing what other support systems or what other EJ initiatives at the state level are lending either resources or are helping coordinate efforts of the advisory body itself. So I noted that there were several states that had separate offices of environmental justice. And these were, again, entities different from the EJ advisory bodies, but these offices would, for example, help execute environmental justice programs, coordinate integration of environmental justice policies across different state agencies. And a lot of them would also provide personnel and resources to the environmental justice advisory bodies. I also noted that in a lot of the bylaws and organic statutes that create these advisory bodies, many of them designated seats with specific roles. So for example, New Jersey has an advisory council where its bylaws designate a chair, vice chair, secretary, and reporting secretary. And I thought that having members with designated specific responsibilities will help ensure that the body as a whole remains productive and remains on track, because these different members have designated tasks that keep them accountable. And I also found that several advisory bodies worked extensively and directly with executive agencies. So for example, Oregon's agencies, there are 14 agencies in Oregon that have citizen advocates. And what these citizen advocates are essentially a staff person within the agency that encourages public participation and ensures the agency considers environmental justice issues. And these citizen advocates are essentially a relay between the agency itself and and Oregon's environmental justice advisory body. And in looking through the annual reports of Oregon's advisory body, I saw that many of them had thorough updates of EJ initiatives from these natural resource agencies that had citizen advocates. So I thought that this relationship between the advisory body itself and these agencies fostered through the citizen advocates, it really helped to drive communication and promote further EJ policy. This next set of research highlights concerns community outreach. And there were several ways that I saw these bodies performed well in reaching out to communities, especially those that were most impacted by state level environmental decisions. So one way of doing it is just through the organic statute that creates or charges and directs the advisory body itself. And that's what I saw with Oregon's environmental justice task forces. Their organic statute just straightforward said that this task force shall meet with EJ communities and make recommendations regarding these communities' concerns. And other advisory bodies did it differently. One way that Washington, for example, their bylaws made public meetings or meetings of the task force very, very public. And so their bylaws require that all meetings are open to the public. And not only that, that the task force should encourage all members of the public, particularly communities experiencing environmental injustices, to attend and participate. Furthermore, the bylaws for Washington's task force require that the meeting agendas include an item allowing for public comment on any topic. And this kind of approach towards fostering community outreach was also found in Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And one last effort that I thought was notable was from New Jersey's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. They had a prioritized process for creating what they call the community contacts database. And they wanted to make, this was in trying to foster relationships between the advisory body and impacted communities themselves. So they wanted to create a database that can be used to reach out to groups in EJ communities and, for example, advise them of upcoming actions or activities. And what the advisory council had is they didn't have a formal definition of an environmental justice community. So they created criteria on what the components would be of an EJ community. And they eventually identified 137 municipalities that could be defined as an EJ community. And with these 137, they then sorted them into different tiers to then prioritize, okay, so this community we definitely need to establish a contact in this community much quicker than we need to for this other community. And so when we think about reinvigorating Maryland's commission, I think this is a relatively short-term project that wouldn't be too much of a heavy lift for the commission, just so that the commission can actually be productive and can actually learn from the people that have experienced the most environmental injustices to help craft their policy. And this last set of, second to last set of research highlights concern the creation of concrete goals and deadlines. I found that a lot of environmental justice advisory bodies have deliverables hardwired either into the executive order or the organic statute creating the advisory body. And there were 3 states, Washington, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, that were notable in this regard. So Virginia, for example, has an executive order that required its body to create separate frameworks for 1, community outreach, 2, identifying risks for disproportionate health impacts, and 3, steering environmental justice efforts in local government. Washington actually created an advisory body through a biennial operating budget, which required the body to write a report on using mapping tools, conducting meaningful community engagement, and prioritizing those communities most impacted by environmental justices. And looking more so into Washington's advisory body, their task force, something that I thought was brilliant was the fact that, and this was, I think, one of the only advisory bodies that I saw that was not permanent. So their task force meets only for a 16-month period, and their hardwired deliverable, this report, is due by October 31st, 2020. So it's coming up. And from the research that I had done online I found that this task force was incredibly prolific and incredibly transparent in setting deadlines and in setting actual concrete deliverables, not only to the governor and the legislature, but also to the public. So this next slide is, here, let me blow this up a bit. What you're seeing is a timeline for Washington's EJ task force. So these gray bubbles are the months, and below is below are all the initiatives for one subcommittee, above are the initiatives for another subcommittee. But they chart out almost for the entire year what each subcommittee should be doing. And it seems like this is, if I am just a member of the public, this is something that I want to see, right? If there's an advisory body that is supposed to be creating policy to help my community, this is something that makes me want to reach out to this advisory body. And this is something that I want to see from an advisory body whose decisions will hopefully improve my community. One second. Okay, and this last, one second. This last research highlight, I feel like encapsulates the possibilities when you have a very productive and engaged environmental justice advisory body. So California, I found, was really the exemplary state. And their recognition for environmental justice today stems from the steady development of environmental justice policy and programs that started in the early 2000s. So in 2004, California's Environmental Protection Agency created an intra-agency EJ plan, or strategy, excuse me, and an action plan. And my research into California showed that, you know, there was a steady, because of the Cal EPA's EJ strategy and action plan, there was a consistent and a continued conversation around, okay, how do we integrate environmental justice policies, not only at California EPA, but also across the state. And what we see in California today is that the state has multifaceted environmental justice initiatives. There are several bodies, both within and extending out of Cal EPA, that assist environmental justice communities in different ways. So for example, on the enforcement prong, California has a Department of Environmental Justice that created a separate bureau for environmental justice. The bureau began in 2018 and it started only with 4 attorneys, now ramped up to 6. But this bureau has filed lawsuits, notified local agencies of possible violations, and has provided public guidance concerning environmental justice. On the compliance prong, I noted that California EPA has an environmental justice task force. And what this is it's an intra-agency working group comprised of members across from Cal EPA's boards and media-specific departments. So for example, air, water, and toxics that address compliance issues in disproportionately impacted areas. And it'll spend, say, like 1 to 2 years on an initiative in a particular city or county. And it's completed 6 initiatives in the past 7 years. And its pilot programs actually earned it permanent funding through the 2016 Budget Act. And the last component of California's EJ initiatives that I'd like to point out is regarding funding to disproportionately impacted communities. So Cal EPA has a environmental justice small grants program that gives nonprofits and federally recognized tribal governments funds to address EJ issues in disproportionately affected communities. This program began in 2005, so shortly after the Environmental Justice Strategy and Action Plan. And since then, it has awarded over 5.4 million to almost 200 projects. And in 2020, applicants for the program were eligible for up to 50,000. So I wanted to include California just to highlight the possibilities when you have a environmental justice advisory body that helps steer policy in the state and helps integrate, not only integrate, but also prioritize environmental justice through the state's agencies. And that is all I have. I'm happy to answer questions now, or I can also provide my contact information and answer them further down the line.
Gabe, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. Before we get to the questions, I do want to recognize that Jeantel Green, who's Chief of Staff of Senator Sarah Alfred, has joined us. So Jeantel, thank you so much for joining us. I would love you to put your questions in the chat so that we can present them to Gabe. That would be great. And while you're doing that, Nick, you had a fabulous comment there. Can you just elaborate, while we're working on the questions, elaborate a little bit on what you said?
Sure. When I was the secretary of the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, back in the early 2000s, we established a community involvement advisory committee, which really is the precursor to the EJ advisory committee. And all penalties that were taken in, half of them went to fund a grant program for disadvantaged communities, basically. And there were a set of criteria that were established to guide the funding categories, and then communities would just apply. They'd come before the advisory committee. They'd essentially make their pitch, and then the committee would select projects to fund. And it really, I think, allowed us to because a lot of these disadvantaged communities obviously are where the industries are located that cause the environmental violations. So we felt that the money needed to go back to the community to help support their efforts.
Do you know if it's still going on?
I haven't checked in a while. It was after I left. And actually, we had established the Community Involvement Advisory Committee just as an ad hoc committee for the department. After I left, it was embodied in legislation and enacted as an EJ advisory committee. I assume it's still going on. I just haven't checked in a while.
Yeah, it's still going on. Happy to report. It does seem like the Environmental Project Fund, it remains a significant portion of the CIAC's work.
So again, please put your questions in the chat. I just wanted to point out, and we'll be delighted to share the PowerPoint, that Maryland had one box checked in the state comparison chart, the first state comparison chart that Gabe put up there. And Maryland had one box checked in the second chart from 2018 to 2020. We were the only, it looked like we were the only state that hadn't really progressed. So it looks like we have a lot of, as Gabe says, room for improvement. And that's really what we're here all about. So I think that there really is, there's an opportunity here for us to truly make a difference in statewide environmental justice initiatives by beginning potentially by working on strengthening that commission. And I know that there's some interest in Annapolis to do that. So I think we can contribute to that effort. So questions, let's start with Claire's question. For the states where EJ bodies influence state policies, were you able to find specific state policies that could serve as examples for Maryland?
Off the top of my head, no specific states come up off the top of my head. But something that I tried to encapsulate was in making these slides was recognizing that some of the more productive advisory bodies, their organic statutes or their executive orders required them to work on just one deliverable at a time. And oftentimes that's an EJ policy either for the state's Department of Environmental Quality, or it could be even as broad as developing a EJ policy for the executive agencies. But I think where the commission struggles is that it has 6 charges in its organic statute, and they're heavy lifts. They're really heavy lifts. The commission's required to, for example, assess current policies, rules, and regulations in the state and figure out their EJ implications. That alone is a really big lift. So I think a policy in another state that focuses or that encourages the commission to focus on just one deliverable at a time will help snowball and will help the commission gain some traction.
So there are two questions here. Veronica asked a question that I was also asking, I think if I understand Veronica's, which is how do we get state agencies, and I would add the legislature, to respond to well, let's put it this way, how to get state agencies to respond to state mandated commissions, such as CEJSC and CEHPAC. And the way I was saying it too, essentially, how do we get the wisdom and the recommendations of these commissions to be heard and implemented by either the legislature or the agencies?
That is the trillion-dollar question, right? And that's something that I tried to make more transparent upfront in addressing the structural support that a lot of prolific EJ advisory bodies, the structural support that these other states have for the advisory bodies, is that it's not just this advisory body working as a singularity at the state level. A lot of these productive advisory bodies have their own Office of Environmental Justice, for example. And I think that is finding state level support is something that I would like to research further, because that is the million-dollar question. It seems like the environmental justice advisory bodies are successful only to the extent that they can influence either the legislature or executive agencies to take a hard look at EJ policy in the state.
Thank you. Charlie, Charlie, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. If you want to unmute, you can pronounce your last name and ask your question.
It doesn't matter too much. If I worried about how people pronounced it, I would have changed it a long time ago. But it just seems to me that one of the issues is, as has been mentioned, the sunshine laws are not being enforced. And how do we manage, control, monitor things that we don't know about? Can we do anything about enforcement of those laws?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. That was actually a component of the research that the Virginia Advisory Council did in 2018, and what I tracked in part in my 2020 research was whether the state or the environmental justice advisory body had a grievance mechanism or an ombudsperson to keep the state in check. There are no specific examples come up off the top of my head, but from what I can recall, it does seem like there's a growing trend among these advisory bodies and among the states to, as they develop environmental justice policy and hopefully integrate it, to have this pathway so that impacted communities can essentially inform how this policy is laid out. I'd be happy to provide some of the more detailed research that I created that kind of lays out and identifies the states that have these grievance mechanisms. And either Nina or myself can share that information with you.
Yeah, please, yeah, you send it to me and I will send it along. Nick asks, did any state EJ advisory committee have responsibility for reviewing or conducting cumulative impact assessments?
Yeah, there were actually several. I saw that cumulative impacts came up the most in the context of the environmental justice screening or mapping tools that either the state or the advisory body was tasked with creating directly, but there were several. There aren't any specific states that come to mind, but again, I'd be happy to share my research results further.
Wandra asked, did I hear Gabe say there are several vacancies on the Maryland Commission? And yeah, Gabe, that's what you said, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, when when I did my first presentation with Nina and Evan back in June, there was a 25% vacancy rate on the commission, which is definitely unfortunate.
Denise, you want to unmute and unpack your question a little bit? Denise, you there? There you go. Yep. Denise, you want to unmute? Did you step away? All right. Other questions from folks? Well, Denise, I mean, I'm not sure if Denise is talking about. Do you understand Denise's question, Gabe? Did any of the EJ? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. Involved with the. I didn't see a lot of the advisory bodies involving themselves in like the NEPA process. Or with environmental impact statements. I think just because by definition, a lot of these advisory bodies are focused on producing policy at the state level, whereas NEPA is a federal statute. So the scoping is a bit different, and I don't think that a lot of the advisory bodies overlapped in scope with NEPA or environmental impact statements. But I mean, that's a good idea, right? Because at least at the federal level, there's already infrastructure and regulations in place for environmental impact statements and for the NEPA process. So that's a great idea.
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was having some audio issues, but thank you, Gabe, for your response. Yes, that's kind of where I was heading with my question. I guess a very like local project that I've been working on and closely following on is the Beltway expansion, which is currently undergoing a NEPA draft environmental impact statement. So I was just wondering, I mean, this is a very localized issue that covers 2 counties, Montgomery and Prince George's County. And if there was like something similar that you had seen in your research, and if, I mean, you mentioned that none of the commissions seem to have been that involved because it was a federal statute, but what if it was like this very region-specific project, like the one that we're facing now?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. This also overlaps with the presentation that Evan Isaacson of CLA and I did with Nina. I'm not an expert in Maryland. So Maryland has its version of NEPA, but at the state level. And that was actually one of the statutes that Evan spoke at length about, and how MEPA, the Maryland Environmental Policy Act, is also kind of an untapped and underutilized way of addressing the concern that you have, right, where you have a super localized issue. What and MEPA would, if it operated efficiently and correctly, MEPA would essentially support the public participation process for that.
So for those of you who were not part of that webinar, I believe we still have a recording of it. If not, we have some notes. We can share that with you. But what was eye-opening about that other presentation was that the Maryland Environmental Policy Act, which was passed in 1973 by the General Assembly of the State of Maryland, stated that everyone has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment. Those are the words that are in our laws in the state of Maryland. Everyone has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment, which kind of echoes the amendment language that we want to put in there. So it's so shocking that we want to have this amendment with that similar language. The Policy Act then went on to say, this needs to be implemented in a granular way. How do we implement it? And it charged the agencies of the state of Maryland to come up with rules and regulations that would implement the act. And that, by and large, has not been done. So one of the things that we at the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights want to be working on with as many other people as possible is urging the agencies to, in fact, write those regulations, to bring that language to life. Everyone has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment. And for those places that have those regulations, because actually, Denise, what Evan seemed to tell us is that Department of Transportation actually did write some regulations, but clearly with the expansion of the Beltway, those regulations might not be robust enough because climate, as I understand it, has not been taken into consideration in the assessment of that Beltway expansion. So there's a lot of work to be done on a regulatory, in the regulatory route, as well as sort of legislative and executive. I wanted to ask, guys, put your questions in. You're all being very quiet, so put some more questions in. But in the meantime, I want to ask, you talked about outreach. We talked about sunshine a little bit. We talked about outreach. There are barriers to participation, right? How did some of the EJ commissions recommend and overcome barriers to participation? Timing, technology, location, language. How did they overcome those?
That's a good question, especially since I think that when you have a body that is tasked with creating policy, those communities that are most adversely affected are the experts, right? They're the ones that will flag, here are the various issues that I'm dealing with, and these are the various reasons why. That's another good question. I think one of the starting points, especially for those advisory bodies that that have public meetings, or that have quarterly meetings, for example, but they're open to the public. I think what is effective for those advisory bodies is transparency, is just getting the name of the advisory body out there. And that's definitely no easy lift, right? But from my research, that's what I saw was probably the most effective way of at least gaining traction in the public, was just saying to these communities, either through, especially through online presence, saying to these communities, listen, we are here to help you, but I think one of the most important first steps in actually helping these communities is just establishing that communication.
So two quick things before we leave, because we do want to have honor everybody's time and stop at noon. Veronica writes, why can't we just ask CJSC and CHPAC to request that 73's NEPA regulations be written? That is part of the statute to ensure that laws, regulations exist. That's exactly, Veronica, what we're hoping to begin to do with MDE. We're hoping to create what's called a petition for rulemaking to request that that MDE at least begin to write these rules and regulations. And this is one of the gifts that Evan and Gabe have given to us. Which is that it's an awareness that we can enliven and sort of resurrect MEPA and use it as it was meant to be used in 1973. So that's something that we're delighted to make you all aware of, and we should all figure out how we can best, together and severally, encourage the fulfillment of this almost 50-year-old act that has been lying dormant for so many years. So just in the last couple of minutes, you talked about citizen advocates. Can you talk about how that functioned? Like, was it self-generated? Do you just say, I'm a citizen advocate, and you would come forward, or were they appointed? Or because that's really very exciting to have citizen advocates. It gets to, as you say, the frontline people guiding their own work. How did that work?
Yeah, so to clarify, the citizen advocates were employees of 14 state agencies in Oregon. So they were already employed by the agency, but what they were tasked with doing was enhancing public participation within that specific agency. And from at least the annual reports that I've read for Oregon's EJ task force, in establishing that point person for the agency, it seemed like there was greater communication between Oregon's advisory body and that specific agency that had a citizen advocate. So they weren't necessarily on the ground. I'm not sure, but they weren't. I don't believe that they were specifically on the ground communicating with impacted communities, but it did seem like these citizen advocates at least bolstered the communication between the executive agencies and the advisory bodies itself.
I see. So there were the liaisons. Oh, so Denise gets the word. How did the EJ committees work with the EJ communities and leaders? So how did the citizens advocates and other EJ committees otherwise engage with community leaders?
There were various ways. At least for Oregon, it did seem like that responsibility was in part delegated to these citizen advocates. But as I had said before, one of the ways is through requiring either in the advisory body's executive order or organic statute that the advisory body not only meet, but meet publicly and set aside time, either oftentimes the time allocated to public comment was at the end of these advisory body meetings. So I think integrating into the advisory body itself the requirement that they meet and they meet publicly was one of the ways that fostered communication between the advisory body and communities themselves.
Fabulous. Well, I want to thank you so much. I will leave everyone with one potential act. Yes, we applaud you, Gabe, as Denise did. Thank you. This is really just wonderful. You will make sure that we have the PowerPoint, and if you don't mind sending the PowerPoint with your notes, because those were extremely informative, and I think it will help all of us. And those who haven't seen you and haven't been able to participate, they'll be able to follow the PowerPoint better when you're with your notes. But
of course,
if there's one takeaway that I think Gabe has led us to, it's that, as many of you probably know, the Senator Ferguson has established a DEIS, DEIJ, and Environmental Justice Commission working group, so that we can get a handle on the environmental injustices here in the state of Maryland. And part of their task is to focus specifically on environmental justice and environmental injustices. And we can all, even now, write to the members of this working group and say, we believe that a reinvigorated and, in a sense, rechartered commission on environmental justice is something that we are looking for, and that we expect that might be a recommendation that comes out of this working group. And then as time moves on and we have better ideas of what we want to ask, we can then write them again and say, this is what we expect to see in that rechartering and recommissioning. But I think the more that they hear that we want a renewed and sort of rejuvenated commission, the more that will rise to the level of priority on their agenda. So thank you, Gabe, for giving us a task that we can do too. All righty. What is the name of who can we write to? We will get that information out to you when we thank you. Make sure that we have your names and emails in the chat if you haven't put them in yet, and we will make sure that we get all that information out to you when we follow up and send you a copy of this recording. Thank you all so much again for showing up on short notice. Charlie Conklin, you're a dear. Thank you. Everyone, stay safe, and please do keep in touch. We need your help. We are all in this together, and we need everybody to stay healthy, and we need everybody to help us achieve the goals that we're seeking to achieve. Thanks so much. Take care.